Professor Chakravarthy, what do you make of this feat for Agnikul, and also how big a moment is this for Indian space program?
Thank you for having me. I suppose I'm audible. This is something that, of course, since I am part of Agnikul, we have actually been working towards it for several months. As a matter of fact, the test rig that is seen in the video was established quite some time back, and subsequently we had to actually integrate the electric pumps and their tanks and all of those things as part of the test rig. And we got the 3D printed engine 3D printed in the recent past, and we've started actually qualification tests in a vertical test stand. The video that you saw. So this is one of the major milestones that we are actually looking at for going towards our first orbital launch. Last year, we actually had our suborbital launch, where we actually had tested our static tests with a horizontal testing capability, but now the thrust levels are much higher, and therefore we wanted to develop a cluster thrust stand. And as part of the tests on the cluster thrust stand, we are now first doing the single engine test, and subsequently we will actually move on to the cluster tests that are actually required for the first stage firing. There are some novelties here. I think the semi-cryo engine is something that's being talked about. The 3D printed engine is something that is also fairly well known. What's going to be new over here is actually the clustering of engines, very similar to, like, let's say, SpaceX engines and so on. ISRO's large rockets actually have a limited amount of clustering, if you will, maybe about 2 engines at a time. But when you're now actually getting to things like 5 to 7 engines and those kinds of numbers, that's actually when the true clustering happens. And that's a test that we are actually looking forward to following what we have announced today.
Okay, and Professor Chakravarthy, after this successful test today, what's the next step? What happens next now?
Yeah, so nothing actually stops with just one test. So there are lots of parameters to be varied. So we will be doing multiple tests of the same kind in order to be able to get different pressures and the different mixture ratios and all of those things. What we successfully did today is actually to be able to throttle with an electric motor. That's actually a first of its kind in the country, and maybe one of the few of its kind in the world as we speak. So, but we are going to actually do these variations. But as the next big step will actually be the clustering of multiple engines in the same thrust stand that we have built.
Absolutely. Also, this is not something that's happened overnight, is it, Professor Chakravarthy? How long did it take to actually, build this engine and build up to this test?
The thrust stand was actually built quite some time back, and then integration of all the hardware started happening a few months ago. And the engine, after 3D printing, came to the facility here. It's let's say about 30 kilometers away from the Research Park's Rocket Factory 1 to the Tayur IIT Madras satellite campus, the Discovery campus, and it had to be qualified, and then we go through these tests. And of course, now we will actually go back to doing a 3D or a CT scan, X-ray CT scan, to find out what about the deformities due to the firing and so on. So it's an ongoing process. Day in and day out, we actually take the next steps further and further. As a person who's plugged in, I know what are the steps that are being taken. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me.
And the printing and assembly and all of that happened at your facility. It all happened in India.
Yeah, I mean, in India, at IIT Madras, the Discovery campus, here, where I'm sitting right now.
Yes. Okay. So now the next step also is going to be, as you're saying, a cluster of engines together, right? How soon could that happen?
I think we should probably get there in a couple of months, I would think. Yeah.
Okay. And obviously the goal is, I think a similar test was done by ISRO as well earlier. This is, of course, a big feat for the private sector. Now, the goal obviously is for us to become a platform for launches, isn't it? Satellites, rockets for the world. It's already happening, but we need to obviously do more of it. We need to grow this domain and this strength and sector.
Yeah, so let's be very clear here. What ISRO did is actually a mammoth effort. The class of the rocket that was actually fired by ISRO on the semi-cryo level for the first time that they did is actually much bigger than what we are doing. What we are doing is actually for a small launch vehicle category. And this is one engine out of a multiple clusters for the first stage of our rocket vehicle. But the rocket vehicle, the launch vehicle that we do is in the class of taking about 100 to 200 kgs of payload. Whereas, ISRO is actually looking at about tens of thousands of kgs of payload and so on. So there is like definitely about 2 orders magnitude difference between what we did and what ISRO did. But that said, I think as Agnikul, we would actually be targeting a small satellite launch market, just as ISRO is actually targeting the large satellite launch market and other payloads for of national interest, as well as for space faring and all of those things. So
Absolutely.
the purposes are quite different, but
Yes. But
but
everyone needs to work in
achievements
conjunction. Absolutely, everyone has their own strengths, as you're telling us. How much potential is there for this sector and for this domain once these launches begin happening, hopefully very soon?
So the conviction that Agnikul has is about launch anywhere, anytime, affordably, which means that we have to keep our launch vehicles very nimble, should be able to trim the engines and assemble the rocket very quickly, and be able to launch out of what you call containers and container trucks and so on. So launch pads are extremely frugal and so on. So that's a very particular what should I say, like a 21st century construct that is catering towards these small satellites. And by doing this, we believe that we will actually unlock the potential on small satellites to be built by lots of private players who can actually access data from space, either it is Earth observation or communication satellites and other kinds of satellites as well. And as it is, there is a fairly good niche market for these small satellites. There are upwards of about 1,200 satellite companies that are at the startup level around the world, at least about maybe about 3 to 4, at least in India itself, very prominent ones that are going to space now. So this is actually the emerging story on the small satellite side.
All right, Professor Chakravarthy, thank you very much for joining us, and all the very best to your team